This past week, it really felt like the world was pulling in two opposite directions at the same time. On one hand, you had these incredible reports of peace breakthroughs, and on the other, the sounds of new attacks. So we're going to try to make sense of a world that just seemed to be a complete contradiction.
And look, this right here, this is the perfect snapshot of that contradiction. On one side, you've got a headline that gives you so much hope, a peace plan between Russia and Ukraine, and they're saying it's 90% done. But then you look at the other side, the brutal reality. Russia unleashing one of its biggest aerial attacks of the entire war, and they did it right over Christmas. This is that push and pull we saw all week, these huge moves toward peace, completely overshadowed by acts of war.
All right, so first up, let's dive into the escalation side of things. Because in a bunch of hotspots around the world, tensions didn't just simmer. They absolutely boiled over into direct action, both military and economic. I mean, can you imagine, on Christmas Day, the skies over northwestern Nigeria just lit up? The Nigerian government actually asked for help, and the U.S. launched this major operation against ISIS camps. And we're talking serious hardware, Navy warships, advanced Reaper drones. Let's be clear, this was no minor skirmish. This was a major step up of American military involvement in West Africa. At the very same time, a totally different kind of conflict was playing out on the open ocean. The U.S. went and seized a Venezuelan oil tanker, the Skipper, and it was loaded with 1 million barrels of crude oil. This was a really complex operation, right? You had the FBI, the Coast Guard, all working to put the squeeze on Venezuela's economy. And as you can probably guess, Venezuela's response was to call it exactly what you see here: international piracy. Okay, now let's pivot over to Asia, because something truly monumental is going on there. For decades, Japan has had this constitution that basically limited its military to self-defense only. But now, with new threats in the region, the country is making a radical change. And I'm not talking about a small tweak. This is a truly historic pivot in their entire national security strategy. And this number says it all: 9 trillion yen. That's over 58 billion US dollars for just 1 year. With this one budget, Japan almost overnight becomes the third largest military spender on the entire planet, right behind the US and China. That is a massive, massive shift. So you might be asking, why the huge spending spree all of a sudden? Well, this quote from Beijing pretty much sums it up. Calling Taiwan the first red line, China put out this incredibly stark warning just as it was sanctioning American companies for selling arms to the island. This is the tension that's fueling Japan's historic military buildup. But, and this is the crazy part, the story of the week wasn't just about things getting worse. At the exact same time all this was happening, there were really serious efforts to build bridges. So let's flip the script and look at where people were actually trying to pull back from the brink. Over in Southeast Asia, there was this real glimmer of hope. After a nasty border conflict killed over 100 people, Thailand and Cambodia finally managed to sign a new ceasefire. Now, this wasn't their first rodeo. A deal they made just a couple months earlier fell apart. So, yeah, this new agreement is super fragile, but it's an absolutely crucial step away from what was becoming an all-out war. But maybe the biggest diplomatic moment of the entire week went down in Florida, of all places. Ukrainian President Zelenskyy flew in to meet with U.S. President Trump to try and hammer out the final details of a peace deal with Russia. This meeting was basically the grand finale of months and months of really tense, quiet negotiations. And what's just wild is how close they apparently were to sealing the deal. Officials were saying the whole framework was 90% done, everything from security guarantees to those sticky territorial disputes. But, as it always seems to go in these things, that last 10%, that's where all the toughest problems were hiding. It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture, the politics, the treaties, the budgets, but we can't forget that behind every single headline, there's a real human cost. And these next few stories are a powerful reminder of the personal tragedies that were unfolding while most of the world was looking somewhere else. 25. That's how many people, tourists and staff included, went for a night out at a club in Goa, India, and never came home. They were killed in a horrific fire that just ripped through the place. And the absolute worst part of this? It never should have happened. It was completely preventable. Investigators uncovered a total nightmare scenario: decorations made of dried leaves that went up like tinder, a narrow lane that firefighters couldn't even get down, and a shocking lack of basic fire safety gear. It was a death trap. Most people didn't even die from the fire itself. They suffocated in the panic, just trying to get out. Then, over in Hollywood, a completely different kind of horror story was unfolding. The celebrated director Rob Reiner and his wife were found murdered in their own home, and the person arrested for the crime was their son. Just a grim reminder that the most awful violence sometimes happens inside a family, not on some distant battlefield.
14. That's how many people in Gaza, and that includes 3 little kids, died, not from bombs, not from bullets, but from the cold. A brutal winter storm just slammed the region, and for the people who were already the most vulnerable, the consequences were devastating.
And this is just such a brutal example of how one crisis just piles on top of another. These people were living in homes in shelters that were already damaged from the fighting, so when that storm hit, it was the final blow. The buildings just collapsed. It took an awful humanitarian crisis and turned it into an absolute catastrophe.
So when you step back and look at all of this together, I mean, the military buildups right next to the peace talks, the huge global events next to these deeply personal tragedies, it all leaves you with one massive question.
And here is the kicker, the ultimate irony of it all. This whole week actually began with something called International Human Solidarity Day. It's a day that's supposed to be about celebrating our unity, about working together to fight things like poverty and hunger. It's all based on the idea that, hey, we're all in this together.
And that really brings us to the core of it, the final big question we're left with. In a world that is literally making peace and preparing for war at the exact same moment, a world where some people are celebrating while others are just trying to survive, what does solidarity actually mean? How do we find any common ground when humanity seems so completely at odds with itself? And that's the contradiction we have to think about.